Civil War an irrepressible conflict that no one could have prevented, least of all President Abraham Lincoln? Or did Lincoln contribute to the start of the war? That's what our guest, William Marvel, will argue with us when we return on Civil War Talk Radio.
Let's sing that new song.
My music track from my modem jack plays MP3s, and I download fast. I read the bits on the microchips, chips, and I burn all my favorite hits.
By the 6th grade, many girls lose interest in technology, but parents can help keep them updated. Go to girlsgotech.org.
A public service announcement brought to you by Girl Scouts of USA and Ad Council.
Attention swimmers, get out of the water! Everybody, out of the water immediately!
Dude, is that?
It's a pair of thunder thighs. Big ones, too. That mom who's been swimming a lot with her kids must have lost them.
Whoa. I heard about this happening once up at Laguna.
Small step number 54. Play with your kids. It's just one of the many small steps you can take to get healthy. Learn more at www.smallstep.gov.
A public service announcement brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
In the great scheme of things, a minute isn't all that much, unless you happen to have a stroke. All of a sudden, those minutes count. Minutes that could mean losing your ability to talk, move, or walk. Which is why, if you can get help in time, your stroke can be treated. The warning signs of a stroke include sudden numbness or weakness of the face. If you experience this, call 911 immediately. Visit strokeassociation.org or call 1-888-4-STROKE today. A public service announcement from the American Stroke Association and the Ad Council.
Looking for answers in real estate? We break it down for you. Each week, the Exeter Group explores how successful investors evaluate and acquire real estate to build their portfolio. From financing tips, tax and accounting strategies, and advice on how to control risk. The Exeter Group entertains and informs while divulging secrets used by the most successful investors. Tune in to the Exeter Group every Monday at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern on World Talk Radio, Studio A.
You're listening to World Talk Radio, where the world comes to talk.
Welcome back to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich, talking today with William Marvel, author of A Place Called Appomattox, which we discussed in our last segment. Before we get into our next segment, I was lamenting the state of my memory and the inability to remember book titles, but with the advent of the artificial memory, also called the Internet, I can tell you the book I was trying to think of is by Kenneth Lockridge, and the title is A New England Town, the First 100 Years, subtitled Dedham, Massachusetts, 1636 to 1736. Professor Lockridge, I believe, was at the University of Michigan when I was there, and the girls considered him the equivalent of hot, whatever the phrase was in those days. I have consciously forgotten that. Bill, I mentioned in the introduction to this segment Lincoln and the start of the war. You've written a book called Mr. Lincoln Goes to War, in which I skimmed this when I was writing my own book on Lincoln, and you take the position that the war, that Abraham Lincoln made some decisions in the first year of his presidency that contributed to the war breaking out, that he might have done otherwise. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I certainly think he contributed in the early weeks of his presidency to the coming of the war, and in the course of his presidency, in the first 14 months or so, he interfered in such manners that I think the war went on quite a bit longer than it would have.
Well, what about those first weeks? There's it's certainly a plastic moment in American history. Things could have gone so many different directions. Where did he go wrong, as you see it?
There are those who would argue that there was no other way for things to turn out, that Lincoln had no other choice. And that I categorically deny. I don't profess to know that he should have provoked hostilities or that the Union had to be saved. But I do question whether either of those statements are true. And I think that at the time, certainly, his view was, it wasn't a minority view in the North, but it was becoming such by the middle and end of March of 1861. There were Republican editors all over the country finally asserting that it was time to recognize that the South is organized as a nation and to let them go, including Lincoln's own hometown newspaper. And I think that was the he being such a nationalist, that was the outcome that he was not willing to see happen, even though he had said he would not provoke a fight. And I think that the evidence that he decided to provoke a fight comes in the timing of his decision. March 28th was the day that the extra session of the Senate finally adjourned. He had no congressional oversight. He could finally act with a free hand, and that was when he appears to have decided that it was time to send a relief expedition to Charleston, which he had every reason to believe would provoke hostilities. He had sent his own emissaries, both privately and otherwise, to South Carolina to ask of the citizens they knew there, and it was clear that there would be a fight if the sovereignty of South Carolina was interfered with, and yet he did that. There is another element that plays into it, namely Seward's background discussions with the Confederate commissioners, whom he essentially promised that Fort Sumter would be evacuated, and that heightened the South Carolinians' sense of betrayal, and that obviously wasn't Lincoln's fault at all. But nonetheless, even aside from that, I think he had full right to expect that his relief expedition would start the shooting, and I think he hoped for that. In fact, he later wrote to Gustavus Fox, I believe it was, and said that even though the expedition was a failure, the outcome was all that we could have hoped for. He must have been thinking back to the Star of the West incident in January before he came to Washington, when a South Carolina battery fired on a ship going into Fort Sumter, and suddenly everyone of all political stripes was indignant and, if not ready for war, at least understood why everyone else was. And I think he hoped to resurrect that feeling.
Well, I was thinking of the Star of the West as you were talking, and thinking that there was an example where war is not provoked, where you get indignation, but you don't get a war, and you certainly don't get a war on the scale of the one that follows Sumter.
Right.
Lincoln, as I see it, did not understand the Southern temper particularly well in the first months of the war. He was, perhaps due to his own nationalism, was quite convinced, it seems to me, that the great mass of the Southern public was not secessionist, and that they had been deluded by the leaders of the South, and it would not take too much to trigger the mystic chords of memory and bring people back into the fold. Could he have perhaps thought that a conflict at Sumter would have that effect?
Well, I suspect that he did hope that. I mean, that was part of the expectation that everyone, including the border states, for instance, would be so indignant at South Carolina, or in this case, the Confederacy. By April, you have the Confederacy there, not just the South Carolina government. And his misunderstanding of the extent of Southern loyalty continues through the war. I mean, by his State of the Union address in 1863, he's offering the 10% solution, expecting that it's going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And he was wrong again.
Yes.
That misunderstanding, which is obvious, is nonetheless no excuse to relieve him of the responsibility of having started the conflict, or at least provoked the conflict that was waiting to be started at the first match.
Yeah, I suppose that's the one can dispute there the assignment of responsibility, as you point out. If one party assembles the tinder and gets everything ready for a single match, and then someone else intentionally or inadvertently drops the match, how do you apportion the blame there? To say one party solely started it hardly seems fair, to say of either party.
Right. Well, I recognize that. Nonetheless, you have to judge your own president on the basis of his actions, given the circumstances. And if a president provokes a fight where one is not necessarily inevitable for a purpose that not everyone concurs in, then there's some room for blame, I think. That's not to say that I'm a detractor of Lincoln particularly. I still find him an enormously sympathetic character. But I think since the apotheosis of April of '65, we have tended to treat him far too gently, and perhaps the result of that has been further gentle treatment of his successors.
It's interesting. Several things come to mind. On the one hand, if we just took a soundbite of your comment when a president undertakes actions and provokes a war where one has not existed, you have to be judged on those terms. If somebody were listening to this without knowing we were talking about Lincoln, they might think you were discussing events today in Iraq.
I think that's somewhat comparable, but there was McKinley in 1898. No war was necessary there.
Although McKinley fought against the war.
Yes, but
Congress wanted a war. Public wanted a war.
Pardon?
Wall Street wanted a war. The public wanted a war.
Right.
Actually, Wall Street did not want a war. I take it back. I'm saying it backwards. The public wanted one.
Yes, and William Randolph Hearst.
Hearst wanted one, yes.
But McKinley was the one who asked for the resolution.
He ultimately did. He lost politically there and went ahead. The other thing that strikes me is your comment about the apotheosis of Lincoln, and this, I think, is a very accurate observation on your part that Lincoln has been treated so gently, as you put it, by biographers and historians generally since 1865, that it becomes difficult to criticize him without falling into the camp of those who criticize him from the lunatic fringe. And there are some anti-Lincoln books out there today that are ahistorical in their approach. So you really find yourself, I imagine, in a difficult position when you undertake to write serious criticism of something Lincoln has done without wanting to be put in the crackpot file.
Well, in one radio interview, I was somewhat taken aback to be asked if my viewpoint was not essentially neo-Confederate, and that was a bit of a shock. But I can understand where a historical dilettante would put those two facts together.
Well, I confess the first time I saw your book with Lincoln in the title, my immediate response was, oh, here's another DiLorenzo guy. And I try not to use that name in public because he sells too many books as it is. And as the late Philip Paladin once said...
he's dead?
Books, yeah, Phil did, yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He was very ill, and last August his life ended.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, it was too bad. But he once described those books as subtracting from the sum of human knowledge. They were so bad.
Well, that's true, but Phil himself engaged in a somewhat rancorous debate with a fellow named John Rosenberg about 35 years ago in Civil War history over Rosenberg's basically questioning the same thing I'm questioning now. Was the war necessary? One of the things he asked was, would it be worth 600,000 lives to prevent the partition of Canada, for instance? And Phil didn't answer the question directly. He said, well, the partition of Canada had nothing to do with it, our situation in 1861. He didn't answer, is it worth it? And, the Canadians have come close to separation that not only would have cut the country in two, but in three sections on several occasions, and there's been no talk of violence there.
No. Harry Stout's book, Upon the Altar of the Nation, makes the argument similarly that the war was unnecessary, but in his epilogue, he then backtracks, pulls his punches, and says, oh, but it did free the slaves, so I guess it was all okay, which is why I think his book is so fatally flawed.
But it didn't free the slaves. Except nominally. I mean, I don't know how old you are, but when I was growing up, I spent my first 5 years in the South, and I remember being snaked out of the colored bathroom as I started in by my mother. It's the beginning of real freedom for black Americans didn't begin until about the 1960s. And in that century, I suspect there would have been
perhaps
another
way
means of ending it.
Well, it's a compelling argument. I always am sorry when we run out of time on this show, and never more than today, because this is really interesting. Hopefully we can do this again sometime. But, Bill, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's my pleasure.
And listeners, you'll want to read Mr. Lincoln Goes to War, or A Place Called Appomattox, or look forward to the completion of the 4-volume history of the war that Bill is working on.
Volume 2 comes out in June.
Oh, there's something to look forward to right there. So, Bill, thank you, and listeners, thank you for listening to Civil War Talk Radio.